This is a brief lecture covering some key points from Bowen's article and connecting these to chapter 25 of your course text. In effect, this is a useful counterweight to your book's description of secularism and religion in Muslim-majority countries. Here, we are dealing with secularism and religion in European countries, and with the attendant patterns of racism, xenophobia, and the like that go sometimes tragically in hand with these. As usual, we'll start by defining a few key terms before moving into a brief history of migration in Europe. We'll wrap up with the politics of the headscarf in France, and with the distinction between different forms of religious diversity in public space in Europe and in the US. Well, to start off with a few definitions here. Laicity basically brings you back to the word laity. And the laity is defined as the body of the people not in religious orders. In other words, the body of people who don't give their first allegiance to religious authorities. In the 19th and 20th century, it's going to be very important for nation states to break the power of the religious orders and to try to get everybody, or as many people as possible, into the laity while keeping the clergy under some kind of control, and we're going to talk a little bit about how this works. Related term is the idea of secularism, pretty straightforward definition. Secularism, though, has a bit of a double meaning. It doesn't simply mean that which is religious. It is related to the concepts of the sacred and sacer, a Latin term which means that which is set apart. What is sacred is that which is outside of the mainstream of everyday life, that which is not subject to everyday rules and regulations. That which is secular is subject to laws and rules. It's in this respect that we can talk about, for instance, a monument as being sacred, even though anybody of any faith or any religion can go look at it and examine it. With this background, let's start talking about a slightly different but related story, which is about migration into European countries a little bit before and especially after World War II. We'll connect these different themes of the lecture right around the end. In Europe, prior to World War II, there was a certain amount of labor migration, and then after World War II, this really picks up. There is tremendous economic growth in Europe after the war, partly spurred on by the Marshall Plan, the US economic redevelopment program to develop European countries that are ruined by the war. Migrants are called to do the heavy labor, to build the cars and to build the roads. Most guest workers retrace colonial roots. Jamaicans tend to go to the UK, Algerians go to France. Turks tend to go to Germany, even though Germany never colonized Turkey. The two countries had many commercial relations over the years. There is very little in the way of planning, and in fact, most European countries throughout this period do not even have a ministry of immigration. They simply conflate immigration to labor and to the workforce. There is huge gross domestic product growth in this period, 5% per year and above, which means there is always a demand for workers. Private firms, for the most part, are the ones doing the recruiting and placing migrants in factories and in jobs. This is going to keep on, and it's going to be the object of very little political attention. In 1964, Armando Rodriguez from Portugal is given a moped as a welcoming gift upon his arrival in West Germany. There are not going to be anti-immigration political parties. It simply isn't going to be a political issue. Until 1973. In 1973, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, drives up oil prices 150%. Why? Bunch of different reasons. Partly as a result of US support for Israel in the October War of 1973. Partly because oil, to be honest, from World War II until 1973 had been underpriced. This was at the behest of major countries like the US that obviously wanted cheap oil. This having been said, it meant that oil exporting countries, the members of OPEC, didn't necessarily realize the true market value of the oil they had. And partly because, for a number of reasons outlined in chapter 25 of your book, there is, in the late 60s and early 70s, pressure to nationalize oil extraction and to kick out the majors, the Exxon, the Royal Dutch Shells, the BPs, and so forth, and to nationalize oil production as part of a larger program of nationalism in the Arab-speaking world. There are more reasons than this, but these, I think, are the three key ones. Why is this important for migration? Right in 1973, once the oil shock hits, Central and North European countries stop their guest worker programs, but quickly realize that they can't kick people out. Partly for economic reasons, migrants who are in European countries don't want to go because their home countries are also suffering from recessions. Partly for human rights reasons. The European Court for Human Rights is going to rule that people who have been in European countries for a certain number of years as workers cannot be summarily deported, even though their work visas have expired and they no longer have jobs. What's going to happen is that processes of family reunion and permanent settlement, as well as asylum seeking, are going to become the primary routes for migration to Europe, because there are not going to be too many other avenues for migrating to European countries. At the same time, layoffs and high unemployment are going to affect migrant workers first, drive up unemployment numbers within those communities, and help fuel a lot of anti-immigration politics. Having this view of migration, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about the politics of secularism in France. So, we talked about the distinction between secularism and laicity earlier. The key thing I want you to know here is Article 10 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from 1789. The idea that no one may be persecuted for his opinions, even religious ones, provided that their manifestation does not disturb public order established by the law. This is actually a really important idea. Everybody is entitled to freedom of religious belief, provided that that religious belief remains something that you hold privately. Once it enters into public space, it becomes a matter of public concern. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, European countries are going to make a number of efforts to govern the ways in which religion belongs in the public sphere. In the French case, they are going to create consistories and official churches, the Israelite Central Consistory of France, the Roman Catholic Church of France, which are going to be governed by very specific sets of laws that have really two sets of goals. A, to give people in government official representatives of the faith with whom to have a dialogue and with whom to have a conversation. So the head of the Roman Catholic Church, the head of the French Council of the Muslim faith. And at the same time, to, in a sense, govern the place of religion in public life. The law of 1905, in particular, governs this very closely by forcing religious organizations out of education for the most part, and at the same time, making religious officials into public functionaries, or basically into civil servants. Now, this may seem very controlling, and this may seem very top-down, but in different ways throughout the world, people struggle to police the boundaries between the secular and the sacred. In the US, we are very familiar with these struggles as well. The Texas Capitol grounds, the Alabama Supreme Courthouse, and a ski resort in Montana have all been places in which the legitimacy of religious monuments has been called into question. In the case of the Texas Capitol grounds, the Supreme Court has ruled on the validity of having monuments to the Ten Commandments in what is, properly speaking, government public space. In Alabama, the courts likewise have ruled on the validity of having a monument to the Ten Commandments in front of the Alabama Supreme Courthouse, with all of the attendant issues this presents regarding the separation between church and state. And In Montana, the place of a statue of Jesus over a ski resort that occupies public land has been the object of jurisprudence and litigation as well. So many societies do this. They struggle to govern the barriers between sacred places and public places. Bowen, of course, talks about this distinction in France, and he talks about this distinction using two particular categories you should be familiar with, namely liberal laicity and public laicity. So liberal laicity, as we discussed earlier, is connected to the idea of the word laity, and is the general idea that people have the right in public to identify as they wish and to explore their own identities. Public laicity is the idea that public space is supposed to be neutral. People are supposed to leave behind personal identities and assume a shared identity when they go out in public. As I said before, all places struggle with the gap between liberal and public laicity, at least to a certain point. But every society, unsurprisingly, does this a little bit differently. And the takeaway point in the French context is that people are free to practice as they wish, but not to use religion as the basis of public policy or conflict resolution. Well, progressively, the wearing of headscarves or a head covering is going to be a big political issue. 1989, a couple of schoolgirls are kicked out of school for covering their heads. In the 1990s, mediators are going to be assigned to schools to mediate between parents, teachers, and students to identify ways in which covering one's head can be legitimate or illegitimate. And in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, there are going to be progressive bans on what people can wear in public space. A 2004 law that was passed shortly after Bowen published this article focuses on banning what are referred to in the law as ostentatious religious symbols in schools. So, covering one's head, or wearing a kippah, or wearing a large ostentatious cross, and this is the language of the law, are all forbidden in public education institutions. This having been said, this is not simply a French issue or a French hang-up. Lots of other countries, and not simply in Europe, struggle in some ways with this as well. Turkey, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, the US have all had issues with the use of religious icons in public space, whether at the scale of the neighborhood or the city block or the body. So, as you read through this, bear in mind the different ways in which trying to separate the secular and the sacred has been a core source of controversy at the same time as you try to become familiar with the nitty-gritty and the details of the policies and the laws that Bowen is talking about.